There are moments in history when a choice seems small from afar, but changes everything up close. If humanity ever truly sends people to Mars, it will not only be a scientific mission, but the first step towards a definitive break with the very concept of home. Because there is an uncomfortable truth hidden behind shiny diagrams and promises of the future. Crossing deep space towards the red planet could become a one-way trip, not by accident, a calculated, cold and silent decision that transforms pioneers into prisoners of an inevitable fate. Mars is not just a distant world, it is a point of no return, not because of a single danger, but because every element of the journey, the logistics, the time, the risk, the cost, and the human impact, converges on a simple and disturbing conclusion. Whoever crosses that frontier may be consciously or unconsciously agreeing to abandon Earth forever. And this possibility, as uncomfortable as it is real, is part of the reason why many internal discussions never reach the public eye. What if the first species to leave Earth can never see it again? The question is brutal but unavoidable. There is a vast difference between imagining Mars and considering it as a final destination. When it comes to space exploration, much is said about engines, launch windows, orbits, and landing modules, but there is an aspect rarely discussed: the civilizational impact of sending human beings to a world where every square meter is hostile, and where any failure, however small, transforms the mission into a death sentence. Distance is not the only obstacle. It is the progressive disconnection from everything we define as human. And the more one examines this process, the more one realizes that the greatest risk is not dying on Mars, but living there. When someone leaves Earth, they take with them a sense of belonging, the emotional reference of a blue horizon, the idea that there is a safe place to which one can always return. But a mission to Mars, for the first time, destroys this assumption. When the blue planet becomes just a point, and the return trip requires more resources than any nation is willing to spend, the astronaut's consciousness changes. Earth ceases to be a destination and becomes a memory, an abstract concept, increasingly distant, that slowly dissolves into the silence of deep space. That's why many experts argue that the real question isn't how to get to Mars. But what happens to a civilization when it places its first citizens on a world from which they may never return? The answer lies not in machines nor in rockets. It lies in the human condition itself. And understanding this is fundamental before imagining any red future on the horizon. When people talk about going to Mars, many imagine advanced technology, brilliant machines, and futuristic laboratories. But the reality is much harsher. The journey to the red planet is not only long, it traverses a region of space where humanity has never lived for so long. There, radiation is not an occasional risk. It is a constant presence that slowly corrodes the integrity of the human body. No matter how reinforced the spacecraft's hull is, there will always be particles passing through, hitting cells, deteriorating tissues. And this process doesn't wait for arrival. It begins as soon as Earth becomes a point behind the crew. As the months pass, a silent transformation takes place. Zero gravity weakens muscles, reduces bone density, and alters the immune system. The human organism was shaped by Earth, and every hour away from it is a struggle against its own physiology. When they finally reach Mars, the crew arrives not as pioneers, but as weakened survivors. And it is precisely in this state that they must face an even more hostile environment, where everything demands additional effort, absolute precision, and energy that may no longer exist. Mars offers no breaks, no mercy. Every step outside its habitat demands perfect equipment, flawlessly functioning systems, and a level of physical fitness that simply doesn't match the accumulated wear and tear of the journey. The mission doesn't begin upon landing. It begins when the crew realizes that the planet, from the very first moment, demands more from them than the journey itself did. The problem is that when the crew finally sets foot on Mars, they don't find a new beginning, but a constant state of resistance. The planet doesn't welcome them. It wears them down. The thin atmosphere makes every physical activity more difficult. Radiation silently increases with each passing hour on the surface. Dust as fine as smoke and as sharp as glass seeps into mechanisms, filters, hinges, air seals. And all this while the team is still trying to recover from the journey, their bodies weakened and their minds trapped between exhaustion and constant tension. Mars is not just a hostile environment, it's a patient adversary. As the days go by, a new reality sets in. Everything on Mars depends on energy. Life, communication, heat, oxygen, water. But the planet itself offers conditions that make generating a stable energy supply difficult. A dust storm, for example, can last for weeks, sometimes months, and during this period sunlight turns into shadow. Solar panels produce almost nothing. Reserves begin to dwindle. And when energy fails, essential systems suffer. There is no margin for error on Mars. Each failure can create another, and each second failure can lead to collapse. This is where many experts argue that the real reason why perhaps no one will return from Mars is not the distance. It's not the cost, it's not the engineering. It's the inevitable fragility of any human structure in the face of a planet that doesn't offer even a single element favorable to survival. The longer one spends there, the less possible the idea of return seems. Not for lack of desire, but because each day lived on Mars costs something that cannot be recovered. There is an even more disturbing detail about staying on Mars: cognitive isolation. Communication with Earth takes minutes to go and return, but the impact is not in the delay itself. It's in what that delay symbolizes. For the first time, human beings would live in a place where no conversation flows naturally, where no urgent decision can receive immediate guidance, where mistakes must be faced without advice, without a supportive voice, without a sense of belonging. Each exchange of messages becomes a reminder that humanity has been left behind, and that even alive, the crew is already too distant to be a part of it. Over time, this disconnection deepens. The Martian base becomes the crew's entire world, an environment where every object has essential value and every routine seems like a survival ritual. The mind adapts because it needs to, but this adaptation comes at a price. The more a person adjusts to an extreme environment, the harder it is to return to normal Earth. Seen from afar, loses texture. It loses the feeling of home. It loses emotional significance. And when that happens, a silent question emerges. Is it possible to return to a place that is no longer part of who you have become? That's why some experts argue that the greatest risk isn't dying on Mars, but living there for so long that a return ceases to be psychologically or emotionally viable. Even if the technology allows it, even if the mission is successful, even if the physical conditions support a return, there's a real chance that the crew simply won't want to go back. Not out of despair, but because their identity will have already been shaped by Mars, and Earth will have become just a distant, almost abstract memory. Prolonged stays on Mars also expose a paradox rarely discussed outside of technical circles. The longer one spends on the red planet, the more difficult the return becomes, not only due to physical exhaustion, but also due to increasing dependence on Mars's own infrastructure. Each habitat built, each system stabilized, each improvised solution for survival strengthens the desire to remain and weakens the idea of returning. The base becomes indispensable, irreplaceable, almost like an organism that cannot be dismantled without causing irreversible damage to the life it sustains. It's as if the planet gradually demands that its visitors accept to stay. And while permanence solidifies, the Earth changes. The instruments show it, but the mind resists accepting it. Each month the distance increases, orbital positions change, return windows change, energy calculations change, and what was once an extremely difficult journey becomes, at certain moments, practically impossible. The crew knows this, not as an abstract fact, but as a constant warning. And this subtle perception that the universe moves while they stand still creates a kind of anxiety that no technology can correct. Over time, the crew finds themselves in a paradoxical situation, trapped on a planet that doesn't want them, and separated from a planet that can no longer reach them. It is at this point that Mars ceases to be a destination and becomes a final frontier. Not a line that is crossed temporarily, but a permanent division between two worlds. A barrier that doesn't destroy quickly, it destroys slowly, through the accumulation of small impossibilities that together form a path of no return. As the mission progresses, another uncomfortable truth emerges. The more the crew builds, the more attached they become to their work. Each module installed, each system repaired, Each extension of the habitat represents months of physical and psychological effort. And when you look at all of this, you realize that abandoning Mars would also mean abandoning the only place in the universe that still functions as a shelter. However precarious, the base is not just a structure. It becomes the result of every risk taken and every difficulty overcome. In a way, it transforms into an emotional anchor, paradoxically tied to a world that never wanted to welcome anyone. Furthermore, the learning curve becomes intimate. Everything the crew knows how to do, calibrate filters, handle storms, conserve energy, repair systems, only makes sense on the Martian surface. Skills adapt to the environment, and over time Mars ceases to be merely the setting for the mission. It becomes the context of their very identity. The sense of belonging to Earth weakens, not because the crew has voluntarily disconnected, but because the human mind always tends to adjust to the environment in which it struggles to survive. And the more familiar Mars becomes, the stranger the blue planet seems. In the end, the inevitable question ceases to be technical and becomes human. How does someone return to a place they no longer recognize as home? Even if a fully fueled rocket were waiting on the surface, which is already improbable, nothing guarantees that crossing space again would be enough to restore the emotional connection with Earth. Because after so much time, so much effort, and so many silent transformations, perhaps the truth is simpler and darker. Those who live on Mars for too long don't return, because they no longer belong anywhere. There is also a type of wear and tear that doesn't appear in graphs, reports, or simulations, the wear and tear of hope. Initially, each obstacle is interpreted as a technical challenge, each failure as a learning opportunity, each risk as a natural part of the mission. But over time, perception changes. The crew realizes they are not fighting an isolated problem, but the sum of them all active, simultaneous, constant. Mars offers no rest, and living in an environment where nothing is stable demands an emotional energy that simply isn't infinite. Little by little, the planet begins to corrode the spirit. Routine becomes predictably harsh. Waking up, checking systems, braving the cold, dealing with accumulated dust, repairing equipment that shouldn't fail, monitoring radiation levels, conserving resources, repeating it all the next day. And the next, and the next. There are no weekends on Mars, no breaks, no respite. The idea of returning begins to seem distant, not only because of the logistics, but also because of the lack of motivation. When everything around seems permanent, the silence, the red sky, the fine dust, the distance, the mind begins to accept that perhaps returning was never a realistic part of the equation. That's why many argue that the first manned mission to Mars shouldn't be seen as a scientific experiment. It should be seen as an existential experiment. A test to discover how far humanity can endure, living in an environment completely devoid of any familiar features. And the darkest conclusion is that perhaps no one will return, not because they can't, but because deep down, after so much time, there's no longer anything strong enough to pull them back. Perhaps the planet itself will silently reconfigure what makes us human. As the months go by, a deeper question begins to emerge. What does it mean to remain human in a place where nothing resembles humanity? The Martian landscape doesn't change. The sky doesn't change, the colors don't change. Everything around remains trapped in an immobility that defies the mind. On Earth, even silence moves. Wind, leaves, water, life. On Mars, silence is heavy, still solid. And this continuous immobility can alter the perception of time, of purpose, of identity. To live on Mars is to exist within a void that doesn't converse with human life. And the longer one remains there, the harder it becomes to remember what it's like to live in a living world. This type of disconnection creates a subtle but devastating phenomenon: the dissolution of the emotional bond with Earth. Photos, memories, messages. Everything loses its power. The blue planet becomes a concept, not a reality. The mind, to survive, focuses on the present, and the present is Mars. The present is dust, cold, radiation, metal, routine. There is no psychological space for longing when every minute demands total attention. Thus, slowly, Earth ceases to be a destination and becomes merely an origin, something that existed, but is no longer part of the now. It is at this point that the mission takes on its darkest aspect: the transformation of human beings into permanent inhabitants of a world not made for life. Even if a spaceship existed that could bring them back, even if all the technical factors allowed the journey, the mind may already be too far from what it called home, not through alienation, but through adaptation, because in the end the human brain learns to survive, even if it means abandoning everything that once formed part of who we are. In the end, when all the factors are put together, distance, physical wear and tear, psychological adaptation, loneliness, structural dependence, loss of emotional connection, identity change, the question that remains is not why perhaps no one returns from Mars. The real question is, how could anyone return? Because returning is not just a matter of engineering, it's a matter of reversal. And almost nothing that happens on Mars is reversible. The environment changes the body changes the mind changes the perception of Earth. And when this metamorphosis ends, what remains is a human being who is no longer from Earth, but is also not from Mars, an inhabitant of the space between worlds. This is what makes the first manned mission so definitive. It's not the risk of death, nor the chance of failure. It's the real possibility that the first colonists will involuntarily become the first interplanetary exiles, not as punishment, but as a consequence. Each step forward in the mission increases the symbolic distance from Earth. Each day lived on the red planet consolidates a new version of the human being, a version that may no longer fit in the place from which it came. When you realize this, you don't see the mission as a round trip. You see it as a journey, and every journey has a price. And if one day a team actually sets foot on the red planet, knowing that a return is unlikely, perhaps that will be the moment when humanity realizes a disconcerting truth, that some paths in the universe are, by nature, one way, that certain journeys were not meant to be reversed, that the first human footprint on Mars could be at the same time a celebration and a farewell. A silent farewell to a world that, despite everything, has always been our only home, and yet a necessary farewell to discover how far we can go, even if it comes at the price of returning. And if you want to continue exploring themes like this, deep, dark stories full of reflections on the future of humanity, then consider subscribing to the channel, leaving your comment and sharing the video. Your participation not only helps the content grow, but also keeps alive the curiosity about worlds we may never see up close. After all, the more we understand about the universe, the more we realize how much we still don't know about ourselves.